I really don't know where Starmer is going to go with this. I actually, because it was fascinating to see Nigel Farage there and pick up this nationalisation line, because it feels incongruent with reform, with what we know about reform. I was going to say reform policy, but what we expect from reform policy, because they are sort of business tycoons, and they say, they're pro-business tycoons, and their argument would always be, let a business go bust. That's the free market. If they can't make a profit, then tough. The fact that he sort of swooped in, and even in that, I was interviewing him, and he even said, I asked him, would you be pro a government subsidy? Because these are higher paid jobs than, say, if you imported this steel from abroad, workers would be paid less. Would you be on board with a subsidy there? And he said yes. I wonder if that's what sort of moved the dial on where Labour are with nationalisation. We're coming up to local elections. Andrea Jenkins, who's the former Tory, she's running to be the Reform mayor against the Labour mayor. That's in 3 weeks' time. I wonder if Farage has moved the sort of the window of where of conversation, and now Labour might actually give in to nationalisation just because they're worried about the locals.
It's interesting because I think that this is how Nigel has been interacting with Scunthorpe in the nationalisation conversation feels very much to me like this idea that reform can be everything to everyone, and so much of their policy is like hybrid of left-wing and right-wing ideas, and it is kind of like what you're seeing with Trump and the trade protectionism around American industry. But it's even stranger than that, because if you look at like their policy towards water, they're pro like a kind of semi-nationalisation of water as well, which is slightly more left-wing than Labour. And then you have this nationalisation policy towards steel. And then also, even if you look at the rhetoric around reform voters of welfare cuts, there was really interesting polling from Grimsby, and it was JLL Partners, and then they wrote this blog about it. But they were saying that the narrative around welfare cuts coming out of that, when they were polling, was that people there were so angry about welfare being cut. Like, there wasn't this benefit scrounger rhetoric that we saw in the early 2010s. It was rather, how dare Labour cut this money going to Brits that really deserve it. But at the same time, they believed those welfare cuts were happening because Labour was giving so much money to asylum seekers. So again, you have this really strange hybriding of left-wing and right-wing talking points. Yeah.
They are able, because they're in opposition, to cherry pick the sort of the points that cut through best, the points that poll best with the voters, British voters, and sort of meld together, which is actually, this tracks for reform, because they've been doing it for quite some time. Like, do you remember the Richard Tice before Nigel Farage rejoined the party? I'd say it would probably be about a year and a half ago. They came out with this con socialists line. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
But so what they were arguing was that the Conservatives were socialists and they were giving away too much money. The state was too big. But in tandem with that, they were also saying, by the way, when we get in, we're going to offer free bursaries to nurses.
Yeah.
And we're going to raise the threshold from £12,500 personal allowance to £20,000. It's like, you're bang on. They're basically just sort of like doing this hybrid of like left-wing and right-wing thinking and smashing it together.
Yeah, and I guess probably in its purest form, that is just populism to do that, to just select what is popular.
There you go. That's a clanger, isn't it?
Yeah. And interestingly, I just remembered this, but when you were saying all the stuff that the steelworks in Scunthorpe manufactures, I said this on the podcast yesterday, but on Monday, they manufacture the steel tracks that go inside Caterpillar trucks, which, like, Caterpillar are the American made trucks, and the steel is going to be struck with tariffs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, wow.
The knock-on effect.
They're doing a lot of National Rail as well, aren't they?
Are they?
At the moment, yeah. God, did you see that story in the, I think it was either the Times or the Telegraph, that civil servants have really fucked up their nationalisation of South Western Railway. So there was a mistake made, which meant that they're going to lease the trains from South Western Rail for the next 5 years for £50 million a year.
Oh my gosh.
And the taxpayer has to foot the bill.
Jeez.
It's so bad.
That is really bad. You'd hate to be that person going into the office today.
Yeah. Did I talk about Port Talbot and about the anger about the nationalisation of it? Yeah. Because there were a number of them who were in the... Oh, no, we went right through it. Never mind. What's next? Sorry. We talked about it. Sorry.
Well, at least British steel might be being used for the theme park that's going to save the British economy.
Oh, yeah, there is that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Oh, do you know what? That was another thing I was going to say to you. So Farage made this other point about Jingye buying British steel and then, using that name, co-opting the name, and then closing it down. He was like, the Chinese Communist Party are going to be laughing about this all the way, because you've essentially taken one of the sort of Britain's big industrial powers and closed it down. I thought that was so interesting because it's sort of like, it reminded me of the sort of conversations we were having under the Conservatives, where, do you remember, it was like sort of Bob Seeley and I think it was Tobias Ellwood and Tom Tugendhat who launched an attack on using Huawei infrastructure in the UK. I was interested because I was trying to think, well, you put up such a stink about using this hardware because you said that it was it was pretty much access for the Chinese government to be able to spy if they were, you don't know how they're putting this hardware together. Why did you let Jingye buy British Steel? Why did you let that merger happen? Because that would have gone through the business department. When you're doing a takeover bid that large, it does go through government. I wonder if it would have even have gone through sort of the monopolies. Would it be a monopoly? I don't know.
It's interesting as well because it's not just steel, and it does make you sound like an absolute China hawk when you start to talk like this. But Grangemouth as well is owned by Petra Ineos, which is one part PetroChina, which is the partially state-owned oil company in China as well. So it is interesting just how big a foothold China has in Britain's industrial capacity, and now in the decline of its industrial capacity as well.
But absolutely. But even with Tata Steel, which is an Indian company, you sort of say, why is there so much foreign ownership? But this is making me sound like I'm a real skeptic, or it's sort of like I'm being sort of like small brained here. But it is interesting that you would allow these sort of huge foreign companies to take over some of your largest infrastructure projects, because they are subsidized so heavily by the taxpayer. And so you're subsidizing foreign profits. That's not even going to go through the tax on that, will not even go through the exchequer. And then when those private companies decide that actually it's not profitable enough for them, then they pull out. Well, you've got an extra cost now onto the taxpayer because they now have to foot the welfare bill for all of these people. Like when we're looking at sort of redundancy packages, the sort of redundancy package that was put together for Tata Steel, or what the unions were negotiating, that is in part funded by the taxpayer. It's extraordinary.
It does make you question just what was the rationale between for privatizing these companies in the first place? Because I think it's really hard for any politician or any consumer, like whether that's water or whether that's in other industries, to name a benefit they've received from privatization, because it's not been lower bills. So what is it?